Good afternoon. I hope you have enjoyed the day as much as I have, and welcome to the Intergenerational Panel. VDS and MDiv student, collaborative fellow, and cohort member 2, Elisabeth Geschiere, will moderate this intergenerational panel. Elisabeth is a descendant of Dutch Protestant working class immigrants who were mostly farmers, and she is a passionate facilitator, activist, community organizer, and she focuses her work on dismantling white supremacy through embodied healing, truth-telling, and economic justice. Elisabeth trained and is trained as an experienced facilitator and an anti-white supremacy education, peer counseling, and restorative justice practicing individual. She is a former ministerial intern and active member at the First Unitarian Universalist Church, where she's seeking ordination. And when you get a chance, I hope that you will listen to her Collaborative Fellows project entitled Knowing Whence I Came, Deconstructing Whiteness in Myself and My Family. Elisabeth?
Thank you, Dr. Smallwood, and greetings, everyone. I am honored and thrilled to be with you today and facilitating this panel of brilliant scholars and people who are going to bring us some wisdom and knowledge. Today, we're here to uplift and discuss the critical importance of not only intergenerational dialogue, but also intergenerational ministry and work and organizing and activism at all times, and especially during this time of global pandemic and uprising, as well as the election season in which we find ourselves. So let me begin by giving you an overview of how our time together over the next hour will look. I will introduce our panelists and share some opening reflections and a question. And then each of our panelists will share their opening statement for 4 to 6 minutes. And then we'll have some discussion time amongst the panelists that I will facilitate, followed by the open Q&A for all of you to engage in. And I just want to take a minute to really encourage everyone to participate in that question and answer at the end. So as we go along, please be writing down your questions or keeping them in mind, especially those of you who identify as youth or young people or the elderly. We recognize that those folks are the ones that are most targeted by age discrimination. And so we'd love to especially hear from you during that Q&A. All right, moving on to our introductions. First, we have Suzanne Watson-Epting, who is an ordained minister in the Episcopal Church and retired from over 3 decades of paid ministry, during which time she was active in ministry development, coordinated an HIV counseling and testing program at a free clinic, taught and published. She recently co-founded the Beloved Community Initiative in Iowa City, Iowa, which is focused on racial justice, healing, and reconciliation. Next, there is Quentin Cox, a minister of good news, teacher, photographer, videographer, entrepreneur, and mentor to many. He is a current 3rd-year Master of Divinity student at Vanderbilt Divinity School and focused on the Black church and issues of economic justice. Then we'll be hearing from Visha P. Souza, who is a Kanaka-Male Baptist minister with a Master of Divinity from Louisville Theological Seminary. Her organizing and activism reflects and combines her passions in areas related to mental health and justice, and is especially focused on Kanaka-Male women and historical trauma. And last but not least, we have with us Reverend Dr. Jacques Boyd. He is a husband, father, Nashville native, and senior pastor of the historic Mount Bethel Baptist Church of Nashville, where he has served since last August 2019. So he holds degrees from American Baptist College, Lipscomb University, and New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, as well as a Doctor of Ministry from Virginia Union Theological Seminary. So welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for being with us here today. And thank you, audience, for taking time to learn with us as well. So I'd like to begin by offering a reflection. "Nothing about us without us is for us" is a powerful slogan which arose from the struggle of people with disabilities in South Africa. I believe earlier Shatika shared this piece of artwork, which is how I learned about this slogan, from one of my favorite artists named Ricardo Levins Morales from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I cannot think of a more resonant phrase for this particular socio-political moment in our country and world. This pandemic, as well as the ongoing systematic state-perpetrated and state-sanctioned violence and terrorism that disproportionately targets and impacts non-European bodies and lives and communities, have both served to expose to more and more people the myriad of ways in which the system of white supremacist, capitalist, neoliberal heteropatriarchy is not and has not been working for us, our families, and our communities. As we are uniquely confronted physically, mentally, and emotionally by this public health crisis, by violence from police and civilians, and by violations of our human and civil rights, we are also being forced to confront the fact that many of our elected officials do not care about us, that in fact, they see many of us as disposable to varying different degrees depending on our different identities, and that they are quite incompetent at best or intentionally mismanaging the multiple crises we are dealing with at worst. Thus, we exist each day and each moment on spectrums, from overwhelming grief to fierce, persistent hope, from simply trying to survive to planting and nurturing the seeds of the other worlds that we want to grow so that we can thrive. From righteous indignation to direct action in the streets or in our neighborhoods or online. From overwhelming fear to terrific faith. From feeling defeated to rooting in our individual and our collective power. So as you, our panelists, think about this phrase, "Nothing about us without us is for us," in the context of this moment of medical apartheid, uprising, economic crisis, and electoral season, what does it mean for you and for what meaning does this phrase have for the unique challenges that people of your generation and/or your communities, however you define those things? And we'll begin with Suzanne.
First, my thanks go to Dr. Smallwood and to Dean Towns and my partners on this panel. To have been a member of this cohort in the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative with scholars and students and activists and people of passion and prophetic witness has been a great honor, so I thank you all. Last summer, Dr. Smallwood mentioned to me that she was thinking about an intergenerational component to this year's program. So I had the chance to begin ruminating on that long before we knew what the theme of this Leadership Academy would be. Frankly, looking back over nearly 55 years of activism has been quite an exercise, looking through a lens of white, cis, educational and economic privilege. And then we learned of our theme of medical apartheid with a great big magnifying glass. I call it the Corona glass. Looking through that glass has indeed pointed toward what Elisabeth asked us to consider, that nothing about us without us is for us. In the extreme, it has pointed me toward the perspective of necropolitics. That is, in an oversimple definition, the use of social and political power to determine who lives and who dies. On March 5th, while attending my lectionary study group at a local coffee shop, one of my colleagues mentioned that someone in her congregation was aware of a possible case of coronavirus in our community. And indeed, within 2 days, the first cases in Iowa were confirmed in my own town. Within less than 3 weeks, the first nursing home outbreak was identified. There would be more and more. And within the blink of an eye, I became expendable along with millions of other elders, but for my privilege. Facing mortality isn't really new for those of us who have lost loved ones or suffered life-threatening illnesses or dealt with underlying conditions, or who are just plain getting old. But being at the mercy of those who use their power to determine who lives and who dies without us, that's part of what the corona glass magnifies for me. Of course, it's not only those of us who are old who are expendable, it is also those of any age who are Black or brown. And it's essential workers who bring us our food, the ones that we trust with the care of those we most love, babies and grandparents and sick people, the ones in the most important jobs who get paid the least. But mine is to look through the corona glass as the old one in the room. In some ways, it feels like I've come full circle. And while I've reckoned with the okay boomer comments, and I've acknowledged and rejected the boomers who enrage me, so have I embraced once again the hopes and dreams and aspirations of so many of us whose most formative years occurred in the midst of marches and assassinations, in the midst of sit-ins and teach-ins, and in the midst of senseless war. And now here we are more than half a century later, expendable. And looking through that corona glass, what are a few other things that I see? Well, I see the same people who have always needed healthcare, still needing healthcare. And this week, we're being reminded of the ways that the intersection of race and medicine simply must be reckoned with. I see people of my own generation afraid to leave their own homes. I see politicians and few civil servants, politicians deciding that we don't need to address the most vulnerable when it comes to testing or contact tracing, or PPE, or be careful about our reporting. Heck, in fact, we don't even need to pay attention to science. The convergence of what Dr. Brittany Cooper talks about as the intersection between necropolitics, neoliberalism, and nihilism. You see the critical need for those of us who are white to continue to invite our white siblings into dismantling white supremacy through education, conversation, and direct action in every generation. I see people dying alone, including my own father-in-law, because the risk of our being in Florida was too great and the nursing facility closed to visitors. And now looking back over all those years, I see those same civil rights and justice and equity issues are right here, right now, magnified by the corona glass. Nothing about us, without us, is for us when we're isolated, placed in age groups, racial and ethnic groups, separated by rank and privilege, which are determined by oppressive systems gone wild. For many elders, the loss of community, neglect, and isolation are obvious challenges, but so are the deep desires to share our experience, to offer hope, to act while isolated in our own homes. We are willing. There is one more thing I see. I see the desperate need for people of faith to stand and act unwaveringly for love and wholeness and healing. Clearly, among those of us gathered here, we know that the us means the goodness of the all of us that God has created. Just as we read God's promise in the book of the prophet Joel, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your children shall prophesy. Your elders shall dream dreams, and your young shall see visions. We are still dreaming. Nothing about us without us is for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for those powerful words. Next, we will have Quentin share his opening statement.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Elizabeth. I'd like to begin by echoing the gratitude, a deep sense of gratitude to Dean Towns, Dr. Smallwood, and my colleagues on the panel today, as well as to each of you that is joining and participating in this important conversation. I think it is your commitment that makes this time not just a talk, but a time that can in fact be transformative. Let me begin by socially locating myself in an effort to provide context around my comments, my ideas, and perhaps my biases. I'm a 44-year-old African-American cisgendered male in what I would describe as generally good health. I am married and a father of 3 daughters and 1 son. I'm a military veteran, having earned my undergraduate degree at the United States Air Force Academy, and I'm in my final year of study in Vanderbilt Divinity School's Master of Divinity program. My medical history includes a living mother in fair to good health who will turn 67 on August 22nd, a living father in good to great health who turned 65 on Tuesday. My paternal grandmother passed away of natural causes at 103 years of age. My maternal grandmother passed away at 95 years of age. My maternal grandfather at 95 years of age as well. My paternal grandfather died in a car wreck in his early 80s. For the majority of my life, my adult life that is, I've been employed in a salaried role, and I've had access to health insurance for me and my household through an employer's provided group plan. I recognize that these factors combine to create an existence that is both marginalized and privileged. As I reflect on the idea that nothing about us without us is for us, I think it's important to frame the outcomes from this current moment in time in light of their historical genesis. A conversation about racialized medical or health outcomes in this country must find its origin in a conversation about the racialized history of medical care in America. Harriet Washington helps us to understand that different standards and practices of care for white bodies and Black bodies have existed since the transatlantic slave trade and the founding of this country. From the beginning, care for white bodies has aimed to facilitate life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, while the care afforded to Black bodies has been grounded in profit, namely the need to preserve the value of an asset or the need to ensure the useful productivity of the same asset. In the same way that you might sharpen a knife to more effectively cut a steak, or change the oil in your car to prolong its life, or provide treatment to an injured horse needed to work your land, Black bodies in this country have been offered health care. Over time, however, there have been other reasons to provide Black bodies health care in this country. When white doctors, for example, needed subjects to experiment on, Black bodies rather than white bodies, be they dead or alive, made suitable candidates. From Sarah Bartman to the Tuskegee syphilis experiments and so many instances before, in between, and after those, Black bodies have been used to feed the fetishes and curiosities of white people and institutions. In some cases, for the sake of science, using air quotes, and in other cases, solely out of deep depravity. Additionally, medical treatment became another way to control Black minds and Black bodies. When law enforcement officers, for example, in Denver, Colorado, could not control Elijah McCain's physical body in a satisfactory manner, a fire medic injected his body with ketamine intending to sedate him. Instead, we all now know that it killed him. There are many reasons why this case is extremely disturbing. Among them are that McClain had done no wrong, that McClain communicated his needs very clearly to officers who ignored them, and perhaps most important and most disturbing is that McClain's death was only thought strange in the wake of the outrage over George Floyd's murder. It was okay, maybe even normal, for the state to kill another Black body. These approaches to Black healthcare are deadly, systemic, and purposeful. Since slavery, Black folks have found ways to circumvent these systems, though. Those practices in various forms developed by Black people have followed us out of slavery into freedom. I grew up in the same city as my maternal grandmother, and I visited her home quite often. There, My brother, cousins, and I would play on a hospital bed stored in our basement. For years, one would pretend to be sick while another cranked the head or the foot of the bed up or down in an effort to provide comfort to the ailing patient. It wasn't until after her death a few years ago that I thought to ask my mom, a licensed practical nurse, why did grandma have this bed in her basement? Turns out that my grandmother provided care for countless people in our community over many years. She wasn't a nurse or even a medical professional. In fact, she worked at a meat processing plant. But when someone in the community was sick, she would move all the furniture out of the living room and place that hospital bed in the center. The sick person's family would bring them to my grandmother's house where she would take off work to care for their loved one. She nursed them back to health, caring for them, feeding them, and praying for them. Initially, it was clear that this was a necessary form of care because so many couldn't afford medical care. But today I'm left to also wonder if it wasn't not just necessary, but perhaps even preferred, because so many people in our community understood the danger of racialized medical care and outcomes for Black people in America. For me, this notion of nothing about us without us is for us resonates in a strong way regarding the issues facing my community. I believe it's a reality that we have known and suffered for generations. It's a reality that we have worked within and worked around to build solutions that support the health and well-being of our people. If something is different today, perhaps it's a more radical approach that seeks to not just survive these unjust systems, but rather to wholly overturn these unjust systems that do Black people great harm. Overturn them with Black legislators and Black politicians who create laws and public policy that facilitate equitable access to healthcare, with Black doctors and Black medical professionals who cultivate new standards of care and practices that are sensitive to the social particularities that impact each individual patient, and with an embodied resistance within a determined Black people to experience the fullness of the American dream that was never intended for us, but that we fully intend on completely apprehending. These will not exist instead of the work and the wisdom of our former generations, but rather because of their work and their wisdom.
Thank you so much, Quentin, for sharing your heart and your stories, especially from your family. Now we will hear from Visha P. Souza.
Good morning, good afternoon. I share the same sentiments of gratitude to Dean Towns and Dr. Smallwood for this opportunity to share this space with the panelists and participants of this year's conference. Working with addiction medicine for the past 15 years, I am able to observe firsthand how the medical field lacks care for minorities, especially Black and brown bodies. It would be ignorant to assume that many are aware of the criminalization of Black bodies during the late 70s, well into the 90s, while there was a war on drugs during this time. Again, I work in addiction medicine, so I have seen what happens when suburban America becomes committed to rehabilitating and medicating while forgetting about the criminalization of Black sons, daughters, mothers, fathers, or any gender construct alike. My experience in my field of work has allowed me to observe the rise of methamphetamine use, bath salts, Opana painkillers, heroin, and the list goes on. The economic backing for communities who can afford private insurance usually get the best care medically. So let's talk about insurance, because when we talk about the health insurance of the American people, or those who have been forcefully assimilated into American status, we see classism. Medical scholar and researcher Harriet Washington touches on insurance companies, which we too see that even in the mid-1800s, insurance companies were afraid to provide full value, if I may quote, full value of the life of a slave, deeming Black bodies as disposable property. Classism tells us that Black and brown bodies and poor communities are underinsured or receive state health care, while private health care assumes that the individual is a contributor to society and upper classes, such as the elite, don't hold insurance. The disparity to access of medical care grossly affects how individuals with mental health issues from every range is affected by a system that is designed to fail them, to fail us. Mental health is a passion of mine because addiction medicine is under the mental health umbrella and grouping. It is exhausting to wake up every morning and know that there is depression, anxiety, fear, and anger that can all be related to the deaths of Black bodies that aren't given proper care. Breonna Taylor was killed in March 2020 in Louisville, Kentucky, while she was sleeping in her bed. The authorities failed to tell her mother that she had been murdered by the Louisville Metro Police Department. What does the death of Breonna have to do with this discussion? Day after day, the Black community is dealing with trauma internally and externally. Trauma that Washington tells us is nothing new. It has been generational trauma passed down to what city commissioners and city councils are calling a public health crisis, known as racism. When public health is being attacked, how can a community under attack be expected to wade in the water and not fight? Whether racism played a part in Breonna's death is not for me to decide, but how the situation is being handled is a clear indication that Black bodies are still being treated as disposable. Speaking only from my generation of 80s babies, and maybe for many after us, we are tired. We continue to bring awareness, and we will fight. And we look forward to being victorious. I am Kanaka Male, Native Hawaiian, a non-Black person of color, who's been committed to stand with my Black siblings in the fight against every system that has continued to destroy the well-being and soul of the Black community. I am an advocate for therapy and feel amongst our communities, we must normalize and recognize when we need a mental health check. As this can feel classist, many Black and brown mental health professionals have chimed in during movement work to protect the mental health of the community, meaning they are standing on the front lines with us and for us. I am a Master of Divinity graduate of Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and I am finishing my time as a member of the upcoming Anti-Racism Task Force, dedicated to ensuring the school is continuing anti-racist work. And I am a member of the first cohort of Vanderbilt Divinity School Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative. Aside from that, I am also a Mauna Kea Kia'i, or protector of our sacred mountain in Hawaii against structural development of a 30-meter telescope that has caused a lot of discomfort and feelings related to historical trauma for many individuals of Kanaka Male descent. Thank you again for having me on this panel, and my faith holds that my experience in mental health can give insight to those who are viewers today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Visha. And last but not least, we'll hear opening words from Reverend Boyd.
Thank you. And as we gather virtually today to continue discussing Medical Apartheid Revisited, pandemic politics and priorities from an intergenerational perspective, allow me to also thank Dean Towns, Dr. Smallwood, my fellow panelists, and all of those who are joining us for entertaining my convictions concerning this matter. Also, allow me this disclaimer that I'm not speaking historically, because that would signify that this is something of the past. I'm speaking currently because we are still, even today, being abused, misused, and left confused. While abuse is nothing new for our community, being victims of discrimination at the hands of systems such as, but not limited to, the criminal justice system, the educational system, the financial system, the housing system, and yes, even the religious system, this COVID-19 pandemic has brought to the forefront the marginalization of Black and brown communities at the hands of healthcare system and alarming silence from faith leaders speaking on behalf of the least and the left out. Many have heard of the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male, which started in 1932 and concluded after 40 years in 1972. And how can we soon forget the Flint water crisis of 2014, which remains unresolved today as the city intentionally switched its drinking water supply from Detroit's system to the Flint River? Or maybe the little known, most troublesome health disparities facing Black women in the United States today, having disproportionately high rates of maternal mortality. Could we be revisiting such horrific experimentation in 2020? Could those be the blueprint of continued abuse, misuse, and confusion? Can we as a community of faith or members of our prospective community of faith afford to remain silent even in our ignorance? Remember, nothing about us without us is for us. Are we us or are we them? Them who abuse is bluntly and intentionally done. It is beyond time for us to acknowledge who it is that we're dealing with. We have been tricking ourselves for many, many years that this group of people couldn't be this ungodly, that this group of people couldn't be this uncaring, and we continue to take them at their word without looking beyond the surface of what people say to what people actually do, which is abuse our community. Abuse is one thing and misuse is another. No one minds being used, but no one wants to be misused. Yet that is what continually happens, especially politically by them. There are generations of people who have acclimated themselves to being second and third class citizens, which leads to closed-mindedness, which causes tunnel vision, which results in being blinded on either side. No matter if you are woke or sleeping, if you are part of the GI generation, the silent generation, the boomer generation, Generation X, or the millennial generation, you have been politically misused the moment anything is politicized, because politicalization leads to political gain and political gain alone. Ask yourself, what have we ever gained politically? A leader of the free world who was elected to a position with little to no support, intentional sabotage at every turn, only to be followed by exactly what he was being accused of being, unqualified? Abuse, misuse, and then confusion. We are confused about our priorities. Which issues do we tackle first? The answer honestly depends on who it is that you ask. We always talk about the elephant in the room as if it is singular when it is clearly plural. We have classism elephant, sexism elephant, genderism elephant, racism elephant, heterosexism elephant, civil rights elephant, Black Lives Matter elephant, all lives matter elephant, blue lives matter elephant, mega elephant, and many, many more elephants. Remember, we can only eat an elephant one bite at a time. Which should be our priority? Those that impact us directly, or those that impact us indirectly, or maybe those we seemingly benefit from the least? Those that are of age, or those which are considered fresh wounds? Those that have short or long time ramifications? How do we respond to the abuse, misuse, and confusion as a community of faith or part of the community? I mean, our missiology should inform our ecclesiology. Do we stand as a voice of moral reasoning as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., United States Representative John Lewis, and Minister Malcolm X once did? Or do we become political pawns of the oppressors who simply develop voices to ensure the continual, perpetual abuse, misuse, and confusion of Black and brown communities? Do we continue to limit our view of God as a God only concerned about our spirituality? Or do we believe God is omnipotent? Do we become the hand up or the hand that held our community down? I conclude with these words: regardless of where we are on the intergenerational spectrum, let's ensure that this conversation becomes more than the moment and is developed into a movement.
Amen. Thank you so much, Reverend Boyd. And before I forget, I also want to take a moment to thank our ASL interpreter, Billy Sanders, who's been doing a fantastic job keeping up with all of us and didn't have these statements prepared ahead of time. So thank you. So wow, you have all given us so much to think about already. I feel like I'm just going to be sitting with certain nuggets of wisdom from each of your opening remarks for a long time to come. But to use our time wisely, I wanted to follow up with this question for starters. So a lot of people are talking during this time of quarantine and physical distancing about going back to normal. You know, when can we get things under control? When can we flatten the curve enough to go back to normal? But part of what we're talking about throughout this conference is that normal has never been good or functional, and in fact has been quite oppressive and unjust for so many of us. So as we think about that, and as sitting from where you all are, I'm curious about what kind of new normal you are working to build, or what kind of world you are dreaming about these days. It would be great to hear, you know, from your experience, from your wisdom, from your knowledge, from your community, what kind of systems do we need to put in place so that young and old and everyone in between is actually cared for and can have life and have it to the fullest. So let's start with Quentin and then have Visha follow him, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, so I think I would offer sort of two strings of thought here. The first is that I guess my first question that comes to mind is, whose normal are we talking about when we're saying getting back to some sense of normal? I think that for Black folk, for example, there's a lot that is happening in this moment in time that is the same that it has been for us for generations. The reality is that other folks are just now beginning to see and or acknowledge or have to deal with these issues and address them in the ways that we've been suffering through them for decades. So to some degree, I think this idea of a new normal or getting on the other side of this thing is a very privileged kind of a statement. There are folks who've been living this normal for a very long time. And even if there are changes that happen in our society or in our politics or in the government or even in the medical industry, those changes will in many ways, shapes and forms not affect a lot of folks who are dealing with this continuous normal. So I think even the question around normalcy, right, is one that we need to interrogate to understand, what is it that we think normal is, who gets to define what normal is, and who benefits from this notion of something being normal or not being normal. As it relates to sort of, what is needed, I think that's a great question. To be honest with you, I think the first thing that we need is an overhaul and a divestment from systems that do people harm. There are strains of thought that would suggest that we might, revamp some systems. And then there are ideas that suggest that we can't revamp some things. There are some things that are beyond repair that cannot be reclaimed or renovated or made to become something different than what they were intended. I think when we look at our medical system and when we look at the ways in which it has existed, we look at its formation and what it was intended to do from the very beginning. I think it's worth questioning. Can we remake this thing? Or do we need to find ways to provide care within communities that is separate and apart from the harm that's been done, right? If we are honest about it, much of the medical community that exists today and the medical care is, again, driven around profit. When you look at your evening television, the majority of the commercials that you see on TV are from pharmaceutical companies, right? So they have a hand in shaping the narratives and the ways in which we see and understand the world that's all around us. I think if we want to understand, what we need in this world, we have to begin talking and listening to voices and communities that have not been a part of these conversations in the past. Let's talk to Native healers. Let's talk to Indigenous folks that have practices that are not dependent upon, drugs or pharmaceuticals or narcotics to create change in people's lives. And let's begin finding other solutions, right, that are not death dealing, but that are truly life-giving.
I agree with what everything Quentin has said. Basically, because if we go back to my work in mental health, what is normal? Because for my patients, everything that we think is normal isn't quite normal to them. Again, that sets aside my Black patients from my white patients as well, because then that looks considerably different too. So just to echo what Quentin said and to say that I agree with everything that it comes down to, and we'll probably get into this later, but the cultural aspect of life-giving. from Indigenous communities and Native communities. So yeah, I just have to agree with everything Quentin said. I can't really, reiterate too much. I could say that, there are some systems that we can reconstruct, but like Quentin said, we can't revamp certain things. And we might not need to, or we might not want to even revamp them, because whoever considers them normal or not normal, I mean, even inside of the hospitals, we get to see how classist the medical community is, because if you're a psych hospital, you're deemed as less needed. So you don't get the proper PPE care that you would get if you were, in an ICU, or if you were on a med surg floor. So even there, it's considerably different. Yeah, so it's basically mainly about systems when it comes down to all of this stuff.
Thank you, Visha. Suzanne or Reverend Boyd, if you want to jump in.
I would just say that I too agree with what both of you have said. I would add just one other thing to question or to ensure that we name among those systems, and that is whatever faith systems we're paying attention to, the theology that that we and our people ascribe to. Interestingly, recently I heard Dr. Aubrey Hendricks encourage us in a conversation with Dr. Brittany Cooper, talk not just about necropolitics, but about the possibility of necrotheology, and what happens in terms of how we're preaching, how we're teaching, what contributes to all of these same systems of oppression. So I would just want to name that.
Also, let me just say briefly that normalcy doesn't always equate to effectiveness. And so we really have to, on a case-by-case basis, evaluate those systems, those foundations, and see how beneficial they are for everyone, not just these one-sided systems that we have been dealing with since the creation and the foundation of this country that we call America. So we should literally sit down, evaluate collectively from all spectrums of those systems, and see how we can make them beneficial to everyone involved.
Thank you. So I just put in the chat that we'll open it up for questions right now. We have between now and 3:30. So while we wait for those to start rolling in from the audience, Reverend Boyd, I know that you in particular have been navigating doing intergenerational ministry in a church that is, I believe, 128 years old.
135 years.
135 years old. So if you could speak specifically to some of the best practices that you have used, particularly during this time of uprising and pandemic, to navigate serving your congregation, which I think could have overlaps for folks who work in, government agencies or the nonprofit world as well.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Mount Bethel is currently 135 years, been serving Nashville since 1885. And one thing that I have intentionally done during this process of being impacted by the tornado, experiencing this pandemic and everything else that's going on in the world today is developed relationships. Without relationships, it's very hard to even communicate. So it's so important that I don't only have relationships with the younger generation, but I also intentionally develop relationship with the elders, because everyone has a part to play. Everyone has experience. Everyone has knowledge. And you have to lead people to not be afraid of change. Change is something that scares anyone because change means it's something defective about yourself. But when everyone realizes that we all can change for the greater good of everyone, and you can lead that change, you can then get results that are necessary, that benefits the entire organization, the entire entity, the entire body. So everyone is then tasting what it means to be successful.
Thank you. Well, while we wait for other questions, I can ask another one of you all. So it is really interesting to me to engage around this topic of a vaccine with this opportunity to have an intergenerational discussion about that. As we've kind of alluded to and been hearing and learning from Harriet A. Washington's book and keynote yesterday evening, there's obviously an intensely complicated history around vaccinations, and therefore various thoughts and feelings and approaches that come up. And so I would love to hear from each of our panelists, as you consider whether or not you would get a vaccine or what wisdom to offer folks about this topic. What are your thoughts and feelings?
So when it comes to vaccines, my father was military. So I was vaccinated my whole life, mainly because we had to be vaccinated. Now that I'm older and I understand a little bit more about vaccinations and I can do the research myself, I'm a little bit more in opposition of certain vaccinations, especially ones that are newer. Granted that, like you said, Elisabeth, the history of vaccines or the history of medicine in general is highly complicated. So I come from a brown community where potential vaccines could kill us off completely because there's not that many of us left. So if we think about being guinea pigs for a vaccination that we don't know how harmful the effects are going to be in the future, it's kind of like doing, the whole Tuskegee Airmen whole situation all over again, just on whoever decides they want to be part of that. And there are communities who don't get to decide if they want to be part of that. So I think when it comes to vaccinations, everybody should, decide what's best for them ultimately, or what's best for their families. I have friends who do not vaccinate based on religious beliefs and have not vaccinated their children or themselves since their children have been born, and have not had any problems. And that's just my thing. I think that when it comes to vaccinations, being able to research or being able to understand what vaccines are and how they're made, or what they're consisted of, can help people in the future decide if that is something that they want to do. I don't agree with everybody just going out and saying, yeah, I want to be a guinea pig for this vaccination. And we have no idea about what that is going to look like 10 or 15 years from now, because you got this vaccine for something, for the COVID, and for COVID, especially right now. I know they were looking for people to do the vaccination, and I myself would not get the vaccination just for some of the reasons that I've mentioned. And I think it's just very dangerous to not do research on it, but it's also very dangerous to not have research on it to actually look into, so that you know what you're putting into your body.
Thank you, Visha. We have a lot of fantastic questions coming into the chat, so maybe if there's one other person who wants to tackle this subject, and then we'll move on to a next question.
If I can throw a thought out there real briefly, I think that when we talk about vaccines in this current age, really we're talking about two things, right? One, we're talking about a solution to this crisis, but we're also talking about the trustworthiness of our government and these corporations that we're given the responsibility to go and develop these solutions that theoretically would be healing toward our bodies. And so we have to also then talk about what role does profit play in this country, both from a political standpoint, but also in our medical systems, right? And in what ways has the need, the desire, the greed for profit tainted the work, right? And when do we begin sacrificing human lives for the sake of profit? So for me, all of those sort of questions come into play. And I think the overwhelming decrease in confidence in our government, the overwhelming decrease in confidence in corporations to do the right thing, absolutely for me plays a large factor in sort of thinking through what does vaccination mean to me and my family during this time period.
Thank you, Quentin. And I just want to uplift one other thing that I heard from Harriet Washington yesterday evening, which was that at the end of the day, once everyone has done their research and had conversations with their family and their community, we all have to respect each other's decisions, which I thought was very wise advice. So next, I'd like to move to this question from Dana. It says she is a pediatric, sorry, I don't want to assume pronouns. It says this person is a pediatric mental health chaplain in Minnesota. And they ask, how do we address the deep despair teenagers and young adults are currently experiencing due to the environment and desiring to spread the pandemic as a boomer remover, if you have heard this phrase? I hear it sometimes from teenagers looking for language to express anger. Ways we have seen the pandemic reveal intense intergenerational resentment and ways to lead toward health, honesty, and reconciliation. So really a question about how to, address that intergenerational resentment and anger. Whichever panelist would like to start with that.
So I've not heard the phrase boomer remover. That's actually deeply disturbing to me, to think that we have folks out there who are thinking about, quite frankly, what sounds to be, genocide in that way, shape, or form. I think as we think about what we need in terms of intergenerational relationships, it goes back to something that Dr. Boyd talked about, right? And that is just the reality that we need to have better relationships, that we need to slow down and take time to understand one another, that we have to build a sense of empathy, where even if I don't understand your exact circumstances, the conditions that you walk in and, day in and day out, I can say that I care about you as a human being. And so I'm willing to listen to understand your way of life, your way of seeing the world. And if at the end of the day, our ways of seeing the world don't necessarily align, we can still be okay. I think that if we have a younger generation that is unable or incapable of seeing, their elders or older folk or however they might perceive them with that kind of empathy and with that kind of understanding and graciousness toward them, we have a major problem on our hands. And it's not a problem solely that lies at the feet of the generation that, may or may not be saying these things, but I then have to look at my generation, their parents, and say, boy, what are we doing? Where are the ways in which we have failed them? How are we kind of this bridge generation between these two generations, the younger and the boomers? How are we sort of dishonoring our boomers? And how are we sort of failing this teenage generation that's coming behind them?
And I think it's cultural too. We had a meeting with the panelists previously, and when you think about saying boomer remover and stuff like that, it does not translate to Pacifica. So when you have like the black-white binary language, it doesn't consider, everybody else. And so like for us in Hawaii, we're highly protective of our elders, highly, highly protective of our elders. So when all of this started, we tried to make sure that we kept them, in safe places, and that, people's families were delivering food to anybody who lived around you that is an elder. So just knowing that, that, like Quentin said, that boomer remover is just very disturbing, because it does sound genocidal. And, coming from a people that have experienced enormous genocide, I just would hate for anybody to think like that would be okay just to get rid of a whole generation of people. So ways that we can lead towards health, honesty, and reconciliation is definitely interpersonal relationships. Because without interpersonal relationships, nobody can bring somebody else in. So the point is to continue to community build, and sometimes community building has to happen within yourself, and it has to be intentional, and you have to be able to, teach yourself, educate yourself, and then go out and teach other people who may be less fortunate, who may not be from the same community or have the same privileges as you, and build those interpersonal relationships, because once you build those interpersonal relationships is when you can build trust.
I think that's incredibly important, Visha. Thank you. Those relationships aren't always easy to build, but just an observation, please, as not a judgment, but an observation that that kind of statement or those kinds of resentments may not just be cultural in the sense that you've described them, but also are symptomatic, I think, of the kind of society that we are living in. Those are very oppressive. I mean, genocide is a big word, and that is scary as a boomer, and for everyone. But the sort of need to recognize and honor all life. One would question where the values are rooted in those statements, and as Quentin says, examine in every generation what there is there to repair. So I am a big believer. A lot of this work is about relationships and about building them. So it's something that I certainly am going to take very seriously. Thank you, Dana, for raising that question.
Yeah, and it's amazing how, as we look across society, we have so many barriers that we have built, but we have to intentionally and consciously build more bridges on so many levels with so many people, so we can move forward in life and not have to continue to revisit these same drama-filled and dramatic things like boomer genocide.
Thank you all for sharing your wisdom.
Can I just say one other quick thing about that? Again, one of the challenges that I have been thinking about is just how we use the tools of our faith as we approach some of these issues. And while we know that we have stories behind us, we know what preachers share with us. Sometimes I think it's important for us to actually develop a little toolbox. I know that one of the things that we love to turn to in our particular denomination is the baptismal covenant, and other faiths have similar kinds of values as what we express. But when we talk about dignity and respect, sometimes I think that those words themselves just need to be broken down a little bit, and that we need to practice in terms of how we value people, how we assume always that whoever we encounter is a gifted person. Everyone has something to bring. So just in terms of, again, examining our own spiritual values and how those are communicated, I think can be very helpful.
Thank you, Suzanne. I think that's actually a fantastic place to wind up because we only have a few minutes, well, really 1 minute left. So in this remaining time, does anyone have any offerings for what tools to add to that toolkit that Suzanne just so wisely mentioned we need?
In 2 words, I would offer that if each of us builds empathy and humility, we can make a huge difference.
Intentional relationship development.
Respect and understanding.
And always love.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again to our virtual audience for being here with us today, and to each of the panelists, Suzanne, Visha, Quentin, and Reverend Boyd. I feel like we are all blessed and enriched by your wisdom and knowledge and experience. So thanks so much for sharing. And I believe if you want to take the conversation further, there is a processing salon happening right now that you can move to for continued discussion. So thank you all.